All right, welcome everyone to the Fall 2020 Town Hall virtual series from the Center for Applied Coaching and Sports Sciences. I'm Kristen Dieffenbach. I am the director of the center and faculty within the College of Physical Activity and Sports Studies in Athletic Coaching Education. And for this series, if you're new to the series, for these chats, these are being recorded and will be posted to the center website within 1 to 2 business days in case you'd like to share this or revisit it with anyone. Please feel free to use the chat feature to chat with myself or with one of the co-hosts that'll be on today, and we can address questions that way. To help reduce background noise, we have turned off the mics and they will remain muted for the participants throughout the event. But please, again, feel free to use that chat feature to communicate and ask questions as we go along, and you may ask questions at any time. You may feel free, however, to turn your video on and off. That's sort of your choice. It is always nice from the presenter and panel perspective to see the faces and to see the folks we're connecting with, but at the same time, we understand that that doesn't work for everyone, and so if you need to keep your screen off, that's just fine as well. So with that, and we're so glad everyone is here, we're gonna go ahead and, oops, there we go, get into today's topic, talking a little bit about too far, when an athlete's healthy eating habits aren't healthy. And we have with us Dr. Mike Ryan from the Athletic Coaching Education Program, the program coordinator, and also a coach at Morgantown High School. He'll be able to tell you a little more about that. We have Dr. Dayna Voelker, who is an associate professor of sport and exercise psychology within CACSS. We have Dr. Dayna Charbonneau, who is the director of the WVU Athletics Clinical and Sports Psych Division over there in athletics. And we have Sina King, who is also with WVU Athletics and the director of sports nutrition with Olympic Sports. And we're going to kick it off by turning it over to Dr. Ryan to talk a little bit about the perspective of coming in as a coach and some of the things he's seen and how this webinar sort of came about.
Hi, Kristen. Thank you. And welcome everybody that's here. Yeah, so I'm a professor within CPAS here at WVU, and I've also been coaching cross-country track and field for the last 21 years in some capacity, both at a university level and the last 15 years at a high school level here at Morgantown High School. And as a coach, and especially dealing with distance runners, I've seen eating disorders within athletes at all levels, both male and female athletes. And it is something that can be overwhelming, both overwhelming obviously for the athlete that is struggling with it, their family, their friends, also the coach and the team, and taking that entire perspective. Today, we're really kind of focusing on orthorexia, which is sort of a newly defined eating disorder that is focusing on healthy eating and mainly focusing on the micronutrients, so that athletes are not getting in enough of the macronutrients, the carbohydrates, the fats, the proteins that they need to recover from workouts, to give them energy to sustain during those workouts, and just to their mental capabilities too in the classroom, especially if we're talking about either college or high school athletes. Some of the things that you want to look for as a coach, and one of the things that kind of scares me the most is when I see athletes start to prepare or compare themselves to either other athletes and their eating habits or within social media. There's a large, as we know now, a lot of athletes are getting on, and a lot of students are getting on to social media, and they're getting their advice from other 15, 16, 17-year-olds instead of professional coaches, dietitians, people that really know what an athlete needs to fuel themselves on a daily basis. Seeing obsessions with posting food on Instagram or Snapchats and those type of things are things that coaches can look for and will see in there. The most important thing that I feel that with any eating and in general fueling habits for a team and a coach and what they need to kind of talk about and present within their team is to be supportive of the athletes and to educate the athletes. We all know, big thing a lot of coaches talk about is making sure you eat well. And sometimes driving that message home of eating well can be taken too far. And this is often what we see within orthorexia. So looking at athletes, that are, or trying to find that balance, trying to express to your athletes that they can eat healthy, but they also do need fats and proteins and carbohydrates in their diet to fuel, and a lot of them. I think athletes in generally are surprised when I talk about the number of calories that they need to consume, especially ones that are training. You're going to see this is going to be more prevalent in your athletes that are serious about their sport, that are wanting to take their game up to the next level. They're going to start looking at their eating habits, their sleeping habits, their training habits, and all those. And just like a coach would direct an athlete onto the field, on the court, whatever sport there is they're doing, we also need to direct them on eating habits along with sleeping habits, so they can make sure they can recover and have enough energy to come out for the next training session. As I said, really what the best thing you do is to be proactive, to be supportive of your athletes. Talk about this in practice. Encourage your athletes to eat as soon as they get home from a workout or from a practice. Let them educate them on the understanding that they just went out and expended a lot of energy during that workout or during that competition, and they need to replenish that as soon as possible, or otherwise the body will start essentially eating itself. It'll start breaking down muscle tissue for the energy that it needs. So having those conversations, don't deny when you see some of the signs or symptoms. Some of my colleagues are going to go over those a little bit later, but don't deny those symptoms. Don't blame it on something else. Don't blame it on stress. Ask questions. If you're dealing with young athletes, high school, middle school, youth athletes, the biggest asset you're going to have is the parents. Have those conversations with the parents. Have those real conversations with the parents about what is going on with their athlete. What do they see at home? Is there sudden weight loss? Unfortunately, in some sports, this is going to be more prevalent as a distance runner. A sport where sort of body image and weight comes into play as far as performance. You also see this prevalent in sports, swimming and diving, wrestling, where you have, or sports that require weight classes, cheerleading, gymnastics, these type of sports where body image is something that is either looked upon or is needed to when you talk about performance. When you talk about performance, oftentimes what you're going to see as a coach is initially, especially if you're dealing in a sport like an endurance sport, you're going to see an increase in performance. And this is going to drive the athlete to continue the habits, the bad habits that they have started. And oftentimes this leads to an increased loss of weight, which isn't sustainable. And I think that is what's important. That initial weight loss and an increase in performance will give way over time to the body breaking down. Oftentimes, the athlete will suffer from REDS, which is relative energy deficiency in sport. So they're not having enough energy to rebuild the muscle, to rebuild the bone. You will start to see female athletes will lose their menstrual cycle. Male athletes and female athletes will see a decrease in bone density. They'll see a greater amount of illnesses, sicknesses that you're dealing with, colds, upper respiratory tract infection, those type of things, all because of this energy deficiency. So I ask that, the coaches that are out there, if you have questions, please ask the panel as we get to that part. And thank you.
You were joking earlier, Dayna, about not remembering the mute, and I almost forgot. Thank you. We very much appreciate that. We'll learn Zoom by the time we get back in person. Well, and with that, thank you very much, Mike. Let's turn over and talk a little bit with Dr. Voelker about what do we know about this from a science or a research perspective.
Sure, yeah. As was indicated before, I'm Dayna Voelker. I'm an associate professor of sport, exercise, and performance psychology here at WVU. And so as a researcher and a practitioner, where I really come at this issue is focusing on ways to improve health, well-being, performance, and safety of youth in sport and other performance contexts. And so I study how and why eating disorders, dysfunctional exercise, and body image concerns develop in young people participating in sport, and particularly how the sport environment can contribute or worsen risk. So I've developed programming and resources for sport organizations, athletes, coaches, parents, and worked with these groups to help them develop healthier body cultures. But homing in specifically on orthorexia, it's an unhealthy fixation on healthy eating. And you can kind of think of it when healthy eating no longer becomes adaptive or functional, it actually becomes an unhealthy way of living. And so orthorexia, it has yet to appear as its own clinical diagnosis in the official manual that's used by clinicians, because ultimately we need more research before that can happen. But it is recognized as a unique set of clinical symptoms that's different from other types of eating disorders that clinicians and coaches and people who work very closely with athletes are seeing. And not just athletes, non-athletes as well. And so some of the signs and symptoms, these are from the National Eating Disorders Association, but I'm also gonna add some things in there that I've seen as well, is you might find that an athlete, is religiously following blogs and social media that claim to promote a healthy lifestyle. And there's no shortage of those on the internet. So oftentimes we hear the word clean eating, which is really another word for perfect eating with no cheating. And so popular diet trends can include, like paleo, organic, keto. I've heard of carnivore, Whole30, Atkins Zone, some of the ones that have been around for a while. And, beyond what to do better in terms of, diet and exercise, the media also propagates what we should be avoiding as a society, right? So we've really, in response to obesity and physical inactivity, we've sort of gone to the other extreme in teaching people to fear certain foods, to run away from obesity, to emphasize that hungry is better than feeling full. And so, with that fear and sort of these proclamations of what a really healthy lifestyle is, you might find that these athletes are refusing to eat anything but a very narrow food group deemed to be healthy by some source, not necessarily a credible one, that they have deemed, pure. Maybe that includes cutting out an entire food group, for example. So you might find excessive preoccupation with health food. Maybe somebody is religiously checking the ingredients at the grocery store, the nutrition labels, thinking about when and what they will eat at the next meal, and even feeling that sense of anxiety about, is that thing on my okay list going to be available? And you also sometimes find that these individuals may have an unusual interest in what other people are eating. And I've even seen some level of righteousness or prowess over others relative to healthy eating, sort of like, I've figured it out, what you're doing isn't going to help you, do what I do instead. So there seems to be this feeling of expertise sometimes over what healthy eating is and isn't. And, the interesting part about orthorexia is that these symptoms can be present with or without body image concerns. And, with athletes in particular who are consistently given messages about healthy eating and exercise, it's hard to study because it's really difficult to detect when there's too much of a good thing. And I'm sure that, our sports dietitian and sports psychologist will share a little bit about that. When are these symptoms, which look just like, okay, this is a really good athlete and they're really committed to a healthy lifestyle, but at what point is that interfering with their daily life functioning and quality of life? So briefly, I just want to give a little bit of my take on how we got here. Why is this something we're sort of seeing more and more of? And so orthorexia is related to what is referred to as healthism. And healthism is a preoccupation with personal health as the most important basis of who you are, and the belief that health is solely somebody's personal responsibility. And as a society, we really emphasize that. We emphasize taking back your health by changing you, by changing who you are, by changing what you do, your attitudes and behaviors. And when it comes to obesity and physical inactivity, we often don't blame poverty and food access. We tell people that they're lazy. And we really kind of do the same in sport. If you're not performing well, we don't blame the system. We don't introspect. We say, oh, train more, eat right, get stronger, don't be so weak, change you. And so those messages get internalized and they're acted upon using whatever information is available, including social media, which as Dr. Ryan, it says it's rife with people claiming to have expertise in weight loss and so on. And so the consequences of orthorexia and other eating disorders, they look like it's the person's fault. You did this to yourself. But really, there is this larger sociocultural context that got them there in the first place. And to resolve those concerns in athletes, at least for me, I think we really have to think about what we're doing in the sport environment as coaches, as parents, as administrators, as essentially stewards of the sport experience, to fuel the problem, but also how to be a part of the solution. And that's, where through my research, that's really kind of how I approach this particular issue, but also all eating disorders, that orthorexia, it's an everybody problem.
Wonderful, Dayna. Thank you so much. I appreciate your take. And I extra appreciate the visible hand sanitizer in the background, modeling great behavior for
yes,
safe environment in our sports and for our athletes. Is awesome. That was really wonderful. And I think you set up really well as we turn over and shift over to Dr. Charbonneau and talk a little bit about that application when she's working with athletes.
Well, thanks everyone. So I'm Dayna Charbonneau. I'm our Director of Clinical and Sports Psychology here in the Athletics Department at West Virginia. And so, yeah, I'm glad to piggyback off of what everyone else has shared. I am a licensed psychologist by training. So when it comes to this particular topic, but also eating disorders in general. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about, I'm kind of in charge of some of the assessment and treatment parts of that, and also working as a multidisciplinary team member with folks like Sina, who's on the call, in really being able to support our individual student athletes who might be working on improving relationship with food, body, exercise, but also hoping to support our sport programs and our coaches with cultivating a culture that's kind of conducive to more, celebrating our bodies and having the kind of relationship with food that particular team would appreciate. So similar to what Dr. Voelker was saying that I think is important to highlight is when it comes to orthorexia. So like she said, it's not a diagnosable eating disorder, but I think what's so important is to remember that a lot of athletes, a higher percentage of athletes can actually fall into kind of a level of what we call subclinical symptoms of eating disorders, where it's not necessarily like they're experiencing symptoms to the level where they would be diagnosed with an eating disorder, but sometimes can have some symptoms that are cropping up that can still impair their functioning or negatively impact their functioning. That's still worth addressing sooner than later. I like to take a very proactive approach with our student athletes, and I hope that they come talk to me sooner than later before something is horribly wrong for them. And so I think this is one example of something that can start from a very benign, I just want to be more intentional about what I'm putting in my body. I want to maybe look at this to get an edge in terms of my performance, but we might have to be careful in seeing how that pattern unfolds over time. And if any rigidity ends up starting to come into place where we're falling into some of that black and white thinking with now I'm categorizing things as good or bad, and there's little wiggle room, little flexibility. If a student athlete, for example, is having a hard time with certain food options when they're traveling with their team because they're afraid it's not clean or it's not kind of fitting into those categories for themselves, then we can start seeing how things are becoming a little bit problematic. So again, from kind of the clinical psychology treatment side of things, I'm just trying to be mindful of what are some of the precipitating factors that might have contributed to if the relationship with food is becoming problematic, and some of these patterns in terms of food choices are becoming problematic. And I really just want to work to explore that with our individual student athletes, thinking about sport history and where they're at currently in terms of any pressure that they're feeling to perform in a certain way, any messages that they're getting from their particular sport environment, their coaches, their peers, social media, whatever it is, right? And exploring that relationship history. We all come from a family environment too, right? Where we might have heard certain messages about what good foods are and bad foods are and how that's still potentially influencing where we're at today. So something that I think is important for the folks on the call today to think about is I want everyone to walk away from this call really taking that time to reflect individually on what is my relationship with food even like, right? Because sometimes we're not aware of how we're influencing our athletes in our environments, right? And then starting to think about what are some of those ways that I want to continue talking about food, talking about weight, talking about body, talking about exercise in these environments when that can be taken in a particular way by our athletes in those environments. So I'm thinking about some of those things that are contributing to where someone's at with their relationship with food. And then what's also interesting is that as a support person who might see some of these things pop up for your athletes, sometimes we want to jump to giving an advice from a food perspective, right? Trying to like help offer like, well, you should eat this or you shouldn't eat that or things like that. And sometimes we forget when it comes to these eating concerns, it's not about food. And so part of, again, my role is helping exploring with our student athlete to dig under the surface, because when it's not about food, it's actually about what's going on underneath that some of these behaviors and some of these food choices are attempting to alleviate, which is interesting for us to consider. And something that I want to, that we haven't talked about yet is thinking about COVID-19 right now and the pandemic and what we're noticing can potentially put folks more at risk for some rigidity in their eating and developing some concerns that maybe weren't there before or that maybe had improved before, but now we're getting re-triggered. Just think about the last few months, right? And we're all sitting with a lot of uncertainty right now. We're all sitting with a lot of things that feel out of our control right now, and focusing on our eating habits, on our exercise habits can be a way that we're attempting to find some of that control and finding, again, that edge to our performance right now, maybe. So just being mindful of that piece, being mindful that, especially for our college student athletes, some of them may have returned back to home environments that were a little bit triggering for them at times, or didn't have social support in place or access to certain food options. So maybe there was a limited amount of choice, limited amount of availability. Some of those things are interesting to consider. Again, thinking about Zoom, we're doing this over Zoom right now, right? A lot of our students in general, but our athletes are also doing a lot of sessions over Zoom where you're constantly seeing yourself on screen, and just that hyper focus on your appearance and those moments too can just be something that's on our radar for why some of these concerns could be exacerbated now more than before as well. So that's just something I want us to consider as well. And I guess just another thing I want to end with is, so like I said, part of the treatment piece, I'm helping our athletes explore their relationship with food, work to improve that relationship with food, in terms of also coping differently rather than using food, exploring those different black and white thinking patterns that have emerged and trying to improve that flexibility and that variety in what's happening. And sometimes also helping folks navigate interpersonal situations, because if you are in a context and a culture where you're hearing certain messages that aren't helping in terms of some of those labels or some of what's healthy, unhealthy, also helping kind of coach folks with some of the communication skills and interpersonal effectiveness skills with setting boundaries with others and letting people know when that's not helping in the moment and helping to shift the culture. So thanks, everyone.
Fantastic, Dayna. Thank you so much. And again, it's just the different perspectives and the different takes on this are really helpful, I think, as we begin to think about this. And as we're starting to shift and talk about working with athletes as they're concerned, it's a perfect time to turn and to bring Sina into the forefront and have her speak a little bit about the work she does from a nutritional and dietetic perspective. And so we'll turn it over to you. And then after she's done, we'll start getting some of those questions that are rolling in.
Awesome, thank you. So Like it was said, my name is Sina King, and I'm the Director of Sports Nutrition for Olympic sports. So what that means is I work with all athletes aside from football. And so there's a huge range of, I work with men's and women's basketball, I work with baseball, swimming, tennis, rifle, gymnastics, wrestling, cross country and track, and I'm missing several, but it's fun in that I get to have a wide variety of eating habits and kind of goals that we set in discussions. But I think it's really nice that we're bringing up this topic because I think I see, and I know I see a lot of it. And so when kind of preparing and thinking about orthorexia, my first thought is that athletes are always praised for exceptional performance, right? So we're always praising them for doing well in the classroom, doing well in their sport, and also doing well with eating habits. It's no secret that there's relationships with food and injury. We know that if we have a better diet, we could potentially prevent or reduce the risk of a certain injury. We know that there's nutrition and its relationship with recovery. So we have a lot of, you could say, like best optimal foods for recovery. That's a lot of discussions that we'll have. Immune function, we talk about gut health and its relationship with our immune function because that's a really strong relationship. We can even talk about food and its relation with cognition or mood. There's different responses during digestion and metabolism that we have with specific foods, like increasing your insulin response when you're having a simple carbohydrate versus more of a sustained stack with other types of proteins and carbohydrates and fat. So the big question is where do you draw the line, right? So I'm always preaching, we want to really focus on nutrition. We want to have that that kind of healthy piece with that, but where is the line? And it's really about when eating becomes a pathological kind of focus, when there's a need to achieve perfection, or purity is a big one, or this superiority where, they're comparing, like it has been said before, right, comparing themselves with other teammates. And in other words, it's basically like it's always on my radar when we're working with athletes and we're helping them. We're a support staff in person to help them strive for their optimal performance. But it's about when it's becoming an obsession, right? So when there's obsessive thinking, or maybe there's the ritualistic behaviors. I see it when I think of that. I see a lot of that in baseball or gymnastics. That happens a lot. Another big one is self-punishment. I hear that a lot. Athletes, they went to a birthday party, or on a Friday night they had pizza, and so what are they doing the next morning? You hear of them going out and running. Gymnasts, I don't think you're going to see a strength coach recommend them going for mile-long runs, miles and miles, but you hear of them doing that because that's kind of that self-punishment association because they ate something that they shouldn't have. And I also want to talk about too just a couple of applied examples for red flags. I know we talked about those things, but when I was jotting some notes down, just thinking about things that I've had to talk athletes through and deal with. The big thing is you start to notice when you form that relationship with athletes, and I do like to say that I think that's the only way, especially from my standpoint as a registered dietitian, that you can really help support athletes through that change is when you have a relationship, because without that, they're not gonna, I'm basically acting as that expert in the nutrition recommendations, and so if they don't trust me or if I don't have that relationship, it's just they're not gonna be able to make that change. So you'll notice when athletes start taking out things that they're eating. So it gets really tricky when they're like, well, I don't do well with that food because I have intolerance, or I notice that my stomach, or I have bloating or my stomach cramps, or when I'm running, that doesn't go well for me. But then when you start writing down and taking notes and piecing those things together, you're noticing that, oh, well, she can't eat peanut butter, or he can't eat peanut butter. They can't have avocado. They're also not eating high, fat proteins, and they're not doing X, Y, and Z. And you start grouping those things together, and then you start realizing that and connecting that to their body composition assessment, connecting to the fact that they don't have a period, and the list goes on. Another big one that we see is they're doing organic or clean eating. So they're eliminating white flours, pesticides, GMOs, all of those things. And so it does become a obsessive kind of way of life, and it's really impacting their social kind of area as well. So basically, my role is to educate and counsel athletes and form those relationships to be the expert in nutrition related areas. So like metabolism, like energy availability. So kind of like Dr. Ryan was saying, where it's, they're losing a period, or you're talking about eating and how much they need to have. And so what is their resting metabolic rate, and how do you explain that in a way that makes sense to them, and they can kind of trust you, where, depending on who you are and what your muscle mass is, your height and weight in X, Y, and Z, your resting metabolic rate could be 1,200 calories, and you went on an 8-mile run, or you went on and had two workouts, and they're not eating above that, right? So you're seeing some issues with metabolism, bone mineral density, hormonal regulation, and so all those things tie into nutrition and the amount of foods they're eating. So I want to say all that to say that I think there's a very fine line, and it's obviously essential that you're going to have to direct them to a psychologist or a psychotherapist or, a doctor. But I think we kind of missed out on the piece of really, we do need to talk to dietitians, because I've heard, when I've talked with other psychologists or physicians, and they say, well, they said that they were having some GI distress with that food. So I said, well, you probably should avoid it. And so athletes are actually looking for that validation to have someone tell them that they shouldn't eat those foods. Even though it might not be an issue with their GI distress, it could be. They have extremely low energy availability, or they're malnourished, and you're starting to see some pain signals and issues with their gastrointestinal tract. So all those things are connected, but I do think, bringing dietitians into the equation can be super helpful to kind of get a big picture. And the last thing I'll leave everyone with before we have questions is, I just like to have this plug on the difference between a registered dietitian and nutritionist. So any of us on this call could all go online and become a nutritionist and take a 30-minute certification and print it out and hang it on our wall. You can even take a 6-month certification. But a registered dietitian is required to eventually, by 2024, have a master's degree. So I have 2 master's degrees. You have to have undergrad requirements. And so we take organic chemistries and physics, and we get into that metabolism and science piece. And then we have to do a year-long practicum internship where we're getting applied, practice and experience. And then we sit for an exam, we pass it, and then we have to get continuing education. So I think that's a very huge difference compared to that misinformation piece where athletes are going to nutritionists versus making sure you're finding someone that's licensed, that has that experience and education to back up what they're promoting. Because most athletes that I find struggle, or we need to work through some of these things like we're talking about on the call. Most of it is stemming from misinformation. So you have an Instagram or a social media fitness expert that has a diet that's working for them, but when they're in sport, they have different energy requirements and needs, and they actually have different needs associated with their frame size. So we want to make sure that if they're a contact sport, they have enough fat mass so you can actually have and protect your body from energy. And so those types of things. So they're getting these recommendations and wanting to have this kind of physique, but that person isn't in sport anymore. And then they're having to have different goals, right? And so it just stems from misinformation. So I do like to kind of say at the end, though, making sure you're working with a registered dietitian when we're reaching out for help and working alongside our mental health professionals and physicians is super key.
Wonderful, Sina. I think you bring up 2 really good points that I think we can highlight for everyone. The importance of the relationship, in building that relationship in order to be able to approach these things and do it with everyone, and also that really important piece of how do we vet and credential the resources and the people that we're using as we're talking to our athletes and help them learn. And so we have a good question here in the chat that I'm going to put to the whole board that sort of builds on that conversation that you started about thinking about the prevention education that coaches can give to their athletes, knowing that the coach is often the person who has built the relationship and is a good starting point. And so I was wondering if the panelists can speak a little bit, going across all of you, whoever wants to chime in. How do coaches help find the credible resources themselves? And we do have a few people have dropped in the chat. How do they find them themselves and determine who's credible? What are your thoughts on that before I sort of hit the second piece of that question? And again, it can go anybody who feels like they're ready to jump in. You're fine.
Okay, I'll just speak to that from a registered dietitian standpoint. So I think if we're going to just talk about specific to sport, we have basically a group that's specific to sports dietitians and working with athletes. And so if anyone wants resources, we have this awesome website that all sports dietitians across the country have supported and given resources to. And so if anyone is interested in reading handouts, resources, giving out booklets, or posting stuff in a locker room or a gym, I really recommend that you print off some of those resources. And they also on that page have a list of dietitians that specifically are working with athletes. It's obviously not the only resource that talks about those things, and they're not specific to eating disorders, but I think it's a really important piece that we're promoting accurate information created by registered dietitians that are working specifically with sport and various activity individuals. And so what that is called, if you type in CPSDA, if you Google CPSDA, it's going to take you to that site. You can print off, there's a link for educational resources. They're made to be posted on social media, to hang up in locker rooms or gyms, or to give to athletes and parents. And it's some really accurate, up-to-date information. And so that's just kind of that one plug piece for at least sports nutrition related information.
Wonderful, and I'll pop that in the chat for everyone. Others that want to weigh in around the conversation?
Well, I think I'll weigh in for a second here. I think to kind of piggyback off of that, when you look at it from a coach's perspective, our expertise is our sport, going out there and coaching athletes. It's also the communication side of this. And we can do as much as we can to try to educate, but we have to understand that we aren't experts in everything. And there are so many facets that come into performance and in sports performance. And as coaches, being able to seek some of those resources out ourselves to get a background knowledge, and then to let the experts take over when you start to be worried about an athlete. I'll say this, that no coach should try to diagnose or treat an athlete they suspect that has an eating disorder. They need to have, if they suspect it, they need to have conversations with the parents, with the athletes, and having that open dialogue then can help lead to the athlete getting professional help. In general, some of the sources that you can, that we've talked about within this panel, that coaches can go to really focus on overall well-balanced diet in sports nutrition. Coaches can help athletes with understanding basic eating habits. When should you eat, making sure that you eat, and bringing those topics up again in practice and moving forward. But I definitely agree that we need to, as coaches, understand that we have to outsource some things. We aren't experts in everything.
Voelker, I know you've created a lot of resources. Maybe you could speak a little bit to some of those resources and other things that are out there from other perspectives as well.
Sure. So through the Association for Applied Sports Psychology, we have an eating disorder special interest group. And so we have created some resources, and I'm happy to share an entire Excel spreadsheet. And really it's just sort of goes everything from sort of the academic textbook to websites and blogs and, the books you would pick up at Barnes & Noble to learn a little bit more about it. Full disclosure, it probably needs to be updated at this point, but it is a nice starting point. And then it is a goal of mine to sort of pool some of these resources, because what I find is you're sort of cherry picking to get the specificity to athletes. But one resource that is always a go-to for me, and one that I actively share in all the classes I have who have coaching students in them, is from the National Eating Disorders Association. It's the Coach and Trainer Toolkit. I just find it's helpful because it translates science into an easily digestible way to understand what am I supposed to be looking for behaviorally in order to detect something is there. And then also sort of guiding people in terms of how to have those conversations and make the referrals. And then just to piggyback off of Dr. Ryan, I find it so important that the relationships with those external experts is established at the beginning, so that you're not always doing damage control. Like, okay, what do I do? What do I go to? And it feels like an emergency. We just don't make as good decisions. And so establishing a relationship with someone like Dr. Charbonneau, like, Sina, like to really have that going ahead of time. Hey, I've got this scenario. What do you think about that? to help guide us, right? And I think we need to do a better team approach in terms of prevention, just like we would in treatment.
Dr. Charbonneau, could you speak a little bit to that, and also specifically perhaps to how do you help the athletes tell the difference between the guru and the celebrity and the person, you know, the difference between goop and quality information?
Well, I was gonna, similar to what Sina was saying from a registered dietitian perspective. I mean, in terms of like a psychologist perspective as well. It's just so helpful, especially for parents, if you're wanting some kind of therapy or counseling access for one of your kids that's struggling. I think it's really helpful. Number one, psychologytoday.com is kind of like a very easy reference where you can look at the surrounding area, and there's a way to have a bunch of different search criteria. So you could look at expertise for some therapists in terms of working with eating disorders. And you can also see who's a licensed mental health professional, who's a licensed psychologist, just making sure they're licensed versus like a life coach or something like that, who might be more guru-ish and have some more, quick tips or something like that, where we might be minimizing the significance of something like an eating concern or an eating disorder, right? So making sure you're working with someone who's qualified, has the expertise working in this area is going to be crucial. The only tough thing about that sometimes is it's nice when we have a mental health counselor who also understands the sport culture, and sometimes that can be a little bit tougher to figure that out sooner than later. We're trying to get a sense in our community kind of who has both kind of backgrounds, but in a small community that can be a little bit tough. But our counseling center on WVU's campus also has like a wonderful large resource of knowing all the community providers, again, different insurances that are taken, different presenting concerns or expertise for some of those licensed providers. So I'm always happy to pass that information along as well. So I think just from that perspective of how can parents know, how can coaches know, how can athletes know, just making sure there's that license that will come with a level of education and training, and trying to potentially steer clear of, even if someone has a really nice website, just really making sure you're reading and checking out that website for like a CV or a resume, or like getting a sense of where this person was trained, making sure that they have their credentials listed, versus just a lot of nice information that might not have any backing to it, if that makes sense.
And this is where I'm actually going to put in a little bit of plug for the Center for Applied Coaching and Sports Sciences, and just the panel members at the university as well, knowing that many of the coaches and the folks that may be listening in on the call are at a high school level or at a youth sport level and may not have access or be in that college space. That's where turning towards programs like what we have at the university and reaching out and asking about the resources and can we help you vet or find the things that are appropriate. And that's certainly one of the things that from a service perspective, especially as a land grant university, we are really committed to doing. And so knowing that you have those resources, even if it feels a little bit daunting, that there are other people that can help you figure some of that stuff out. And I did want to ask all of you on the panel your thoughts on, we've been talking from a sort of the psychosocial perspective from quite a bit. And there was a question here about something that Dr. Ryan mentioned early on, when you start to see the physiological impact, RED syndrome, where we're starting to have reduced energy deficiency concerns, and in female athletes in particular, loss of periods. I'd love to hear the panel speak just a little bit about the interface between the coach and the medical professional when you have an athletic trainer, or maybe when you don't, if you're at the high school youth level. How do coaches perhaps deal when an eating concern is pushing that way?
Well, I guess I'll say, I'll start with that. I mean, I think the first thing, as I said, is that communication with the parents. I also think that, a big part, and I'm glad you brought this back up, because, this was traditionally defined as a female athlete triad, because it affected female athletes more than it affected male athletes. I love the fact that a few years ago they changed this to include just the relative energy deficiency, because I've known male athletes to have suffered from the same thing. And the constant stress fractures, the constant injuries, because of they're not eating enough. They're not replenishing the body like they should on a regular basis. So you'll start to see this. I think when as a coach, you start to see these frequent injuries, not just always skeletal injuries, such as bone reactions or stress fractures, also just injuries, illness, sickness. You're starting to get a lot of upper respiratory tract infections. You're starting to see a weight loss, a tiredness. Those are the times where you probably need to sit down and have that conversation with the athlete. And trust me, I know as a 46-year-old male who coaches 14 and 15-year-olds, most of them don't want to just come out and talk about their menstrual cycle to you. So again, being able to have a relationship first with those athletes, so they feel comfortable and they feel secure about talking to you as a coach about some really, really personal things that may be going on in their life. And then, as sort of everybody said, to have those resources there on hand so that you can direct the athlete to people that are experts in that field. And the job of the coach is to be supportive of this process, to be understanding, to maybe this athlete needs a reduction in training. Maybe they need time completely off from training so they can focus on themselves and their body before they can get back to regular training. Trying to train through something like this could be detrimental to their overall development and their overall performance. So it needs to be a multi-level approach to this. And I think when you look at high school coaches, a little different than college coaches, we don't always have access as a high school coach to the experts. So it has to come through a parent. The HIPAA laws don't allow sport psychologists and nutritionists to talk directly to the coach that may be dealing with that athlete. Oftentimes they talk to the parent, and the parent needs to have that conversation with the coach, and then an understanding of how all three of those are working together.
I can just provide a little bit of commentary. This gets really tough in terms of, I saw in the chat, was there a question about when a female athlete is missing her period, should you suspend sport participation until it returns? And, from a coaching perspective, I would rely on the medical professional, because even if it's not an eating disorder, it is not, something is going on relative to that menstrual cycle. It is never normal, despite what, popular beliefs suggest. It means that the woman is pregnant or something else is going on that needs to be checked out. And so, this idea even that a woman that's missing her period, that's a sign of she's working hard in athletic development. And that was so ingrained in me, even as an athlete, that I did not learn that was not true until I got to my PhD program. I mean, that's a long time. And I was in class sitting there dumbfounded. And so the myth is still out there. And so I think we do need to do a good job of educating. The other part, though, is, in following suit with the medical professional, there's also some controversy in the medical field with regards to whether and when those athletes who are showing signs and symptoms should be taken away from and immersed back into sport. I mean, there really is some debate. And the Victory program at McCallum Place, that is a eating disorder treatment facility designed specifically for athletes. One of the things that they do is they have a strength and conditioning coach where they're trying to still integrate those athletes in some levels of physical activity, because when you just pull somebody and you just say, well, you don't have your periods, or you're showing signs and symptoms of an eating disorder, we're going to take this away from you, you steal a part of their identity. And so what good is that doing? And so what they're really trying to do is do some research about safe exercise with athletes who are experiencing eating disorders. And so, we're not there yet to where I could just tell you exactly how to handle it. I don't think any of us could. This is sort of an evolving science and an evolving art in terms of communication. But what I would almost recommend is that, follow the guidance of the medical professional, but also just kind of ask, what can I do to still involve this person in the sport climate, so to help them feel whole as they're going through something really weighty and tremendous in their lives. So that would just be sort of like my little tidbit in relation to that, because it is tricky. It's very tricky. It's more complex than meets the eye.
I just want to add something really quickly for that. I do think we talked a lot about licensure, and I think it's extremely important to make sure you're finding those people for your athletes. But I also think there's a big part where I don't want anyone to say, well, like, I know I can't talk about nutrition, I'm not a dietitian. I think you can still talk about it. And I actually promote and I want people to talk about it and make it a common everyday. Hey, let's just talk about if we had breakfast today, or like maybe share with your athletes the breakfast that you had, because out of anyone, when you work with athletes, the one that they listen to the most is usually the coach. Even, you know, not even sometimes as much as the parents or someone that I would say I'm an expert in nutrition and foods, right? But they're still going to say, well, this is what my coach said. So I do think having common, just every day, you're allowed to give out basic nutrition information where as coaches, you should probably know carbohydrates are before physical activity, or it's okay to talk about, did you have lunch today, or talk about making sure we're having dinner, and just making it a kind of, you know, not a hush topic about talking about food, because then I think that's when we kind of go in the opposite direction too. Just we're not giving specific nutrition advice for medical nutrition therapy, but we're also making it known that we're allowed to talk about those things.
And I'm just going to add a couple last points based on what everyone else was saying, but just similar to what Sina was just saying, I think I said earlier, again, being able to use your voice in how you want to shape the culture within your sport program, right? And a little bit more, I guess, from my side of things, the messages you might be perpetuating in terms of body weight, exercise, food that you might not even be aware of. Like, I know the I feel fat comes up all the time, right? Or some comments about how we're feeling about our bodies or things like that we might not even notice we're saying. But if you have athletes that are hyper focusing on some of those things and then they're hearing it from folks within that culture, like just thinking about some of that language and how we want to shift that around a little bit, those are ways that you can start actively kind of shifting that process too. And just want to highlight again what everyone's been saying, just the importance of the treatment team approach, right? And I know it is harder at the high school level and at the youth sport level, being proactive with making sure you have all those contacts and those folks that you want to use as part of your treatment team if something like this comes up proactively. And at the college level, sometimes we have that in place, but just remembering, yeah, you don't have to wear every hat, right? And that, and it's so helpful when you can work collaboratively and everyone's aware of like, this is my role in this is what I'm helping in this situation. Because it is easy to kind of blur those lines, especially when you don't feel like you have access to certain folks. And so just remembering, because it is complex, that treatment team approach is so much more helpful.
Fantastic panel. Thank you so much. And as we sort of pull this to a close, wanted to really thank the panel, because I think, you know, one of the goals of these town hall meetings is to really provide evidence-based practice. And as was mentioned by the panel, some of this is emerging science and it's continuing to grow and evolve. And we tend to sometimes think about sport being a set thing because we played it when we were young and now it's just is, but it really is an evolving area that's informed by so many different sciences, and it really takes a collaborative to make sure we're staying at the front of the evidence-based practice. And that's really the goal of the center and what we're working to do, to empower and connect and support coaches and athletes and the systems of sport within West Virginia. So thank you again to our panel, really great panel. We will be taking the information from this and pushing this into an infographic. This recording will also be posted up onto the center website. We do have, there's some other information, some resources. Sina provided this one, and there were a number of things that came up in the chat that we'll make sure get put up on that website in a day or so as we pull that together, so that you may share that and use that as you need it and when you need it. And we hope that you've enjoyed this take on orthorexia and this conversation about how athletes can talk to how coaches and athletes can talk about healthy eating and healthy nutrition from several different perspectives and takes. And we really look forward to hopefully seeing you at future events. We have dates set. We have not yet figured times and topics. We are looking for things that coaches and parents want to hear about. So please drop us a message. Get in touch with us. Let us know what you're interested in learning more about as coaches and how we can best support you. So thank you again for your time. Thank you to our panel very much for their time. And we look forward to seeing all of you healthy and safe at the next town hall in September. Have a great day.